Well, hello there. I'm so glad you could make it for more great stories told around a cozy fire. Welcome to Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. Let's get these great stories started and see what we can find to talk about today. Let's get things started off with a story about one of your favorite subjects, cats, I'm sure. Let's hear a children's story that's anything but, about a place where even cats won't go. Harold would never forget the strange house in the middle of the cul-de-sac. There were all sorts of rumors about that house, but most were just the stories children made up to explain strange things. The local kids said that the woman who lived there was a witch. They said that she kidnapped and ate children. They said that if you went by that house at night, you could see strange lights coming from the basement. And sometimes you could hear screams after dark. They claimed that she had lived there for years and years, and that the old woman had existed there for generations. When Harold asked his mother about these things, she said that Mrs. Renfro was just a lonely old lady who lived all alone. However, his friend Davy Parker insisted that she was a witch. If she's just a normal old lady, how come animals won't go into her house? On that, he was right. Not all animals, Harold supposed. Mostly just cats. Cats would not come anywhere near Miss Renfro's house. There were many strays on the road, cats squatting in people's yards to hunt mice or snakes, but none of them would go anywhere near Miss Renfro's house. The cats wouldn't even use the sidewalk in front of her fence. You could watch them sometimes, as they stopped at the fence line and crossed the street instead, risking being hit by traffic instead of walking near her home. It was as if there was a magnetic pulse around the place that repelled members of the feline race. She owned cats, of course. The boys had seen her take many of them into the house, all of them hissing and yowling as they battered against their carrier. Once they went in, though, they never saw any of them again. There was talk around town that the local animal shelter wouldn't give her cats anymore. They said that she'd been housing about 4 to 5 a year for as long as anyone could remember. But when a well check found that none of the cats were on the premises, they had stopped letting her foster them. That didn't stop her from getting them, though. She had traps that she set up around town and worked out a deal with the local dog catcher to bring her cats when he found them. Mr. Barley was not what you would call a nice guy. He was mean enough to dogs, and most people would believe that he would trap cats for her. His son Thomas was a big brute, known for throwing bags of animals into the local river for entertainment. He'd been picked up by the police a time or two for hurting people's pets, and that kind of behavior was usually learned from somewhere. Harold and his friends, Ralph, Stephen, and Davy, had been watching the house for as long as they could remember. Mrs. Renfro never decorated for holidays. She never handed out candy for Halloween. She never returned any of the balls or toys that might land in her yard, and chased away anyone who tried to retrieve them. No one ever went there to sell magazines or chocolate bars for school fundraisers, and if they tried, they were always chased away. Mrs. Renfro was a sour old woman, somewhere in her late 50s or early 60s, but there was talk that she might have been older than that. Harold's mother told him about how Mrs. Renfro had acted the same way when she was a kid. It couldn't have been the same Mrs. Renfro, though it does look just like her. She constantly ran kids off her property, or yelled at those who rode their bikes too close to the fence. She was a sour old crone, but this must be her daughter or a cousin or something. The Mrs. Renfro that I knew would be older than dirt by now. She told the boys this story as they sat eating watermelon on the back porch one summer, and it sparked a real fire in them. They wanted to know more about Mrs. Renfro, and in their minds, it could absolutely be the same one. Her reputation for being a wicked old witch had been cemented in the minds of most of the town's children. The idea that she had existed there for multiple generations wasn't as far-fetched as Harold's mom had thought it was. So, as they started their school break, the boys began spying on their reclusive neighbor. Like the nerd he was, Ralph wanted to start with the boring bits. "We should go to the library. We can see if they have the same Mrs. Renfro that lived there when Harold's mom was a kid." "And how are we going to do that?" Davy asked. "You know they're not going to let a bunch of kids go and look at records like that. Those kinds of things are only for lawyers and policemen." The two had argued about it, but in the end, they had decided that some good old-fashioned surveillance might be their best option. So, they had staked out the old lady's house for the next week. The boys left on their bikes around daybreak and got a good spot on Davy's front porch. Davy's house was right across from hers on the cul-de-sac and had the best view of her front yard. They stayed and watched the house until the streetlights came on, all of them racing for home before they got into trouble. The streetlights meant it was dinner time, and missing dinner would make their mothers into bigger monsters than that mean old witch, Mrs. Renfro. After 5 days, the boys hadn't seen much, besides Mrs. Renfro coming home with a new cat in a carrier. Davy was getting frustrated as the sun set on Friday afternoon. "This is stupid," he said as he threw his binoculars against the grass. "We've given up 2 perfectly good baseball games, a bike race with Mark Hollister, and a chance to go to the movies on Thursday, just to watch this old lady's house." "Well, how else do you think we're going to find anything out?" Harold asked. Davy thought about it for a minute, and then he got an idea. He went inside, and the other 3 boys heard him talking to his mother. He was using his pleading voice, the voice he put on when he was trying to convince her to give him some money or let him do something. They all knew he would manage whatever he was after. Davy's mom was a soft touch, and always had been. After a little back and forth, they heard him exclaim how much he loved her and come back outside. He had his chest puffed out as he came to join them, and a smile that made him look like the cat that had caught the canary. "Ask your parents when you get home tonight if you can stay on Saturday. I think most of the good stuff happens after dark, so we can watch from the front windows and catch it." They all agreed, saying that sounded like a great idea. Davy's dad, a trucker who was on the road more than not, was still off on a delivery. Davy's mom was the doting sort, who loved to give her son whatever he wanted. That meant that even if they didn't catch Mrs. Renfro in anything, they could still play Super Nintendo or watch scary movies in his room. Even if they didn't solve the mystery of the neighborhood witch, it would still be a fun night. To no one's surprise, their parents agreed to let them stay the night, and as the sun began to set Saturday night, all 4 were in the living room with their binoculars out. Davy's mother had told them to not make too much racket and gone up to read in her bed. They were trying to be sneaky, but anyone could have seen the binoculars hiding underneath Mrs. Parker's gauzy curtains in the living room. It had been a slow day on watch, and the boys hadn't seen Mrs. Renfro leave her house all day. They supposed she might have snuck out while they were eating lunch or munching on the pizza that Davy's mom had bought them, but they doubted it. Her old van was still in the same position, and the package the postman had left that morning was still sitting on the doorstep. It had been an all-day event, and the boys almost vibrated with excitement as they watched the sun set behind her creepy old house. As darkness began to fall, Stephen said he thought he saw something from one of the basement windows. They all looked in that direction, and sure enough, there was something going on down there. A weird funhouse glow was coming from the windows, a soupy green color, like you saw in scary movies. Davy said he thought he saw smoke, too, and the longer they looked, the more the boys imagined that they could see smoke curling up from underneath the windowsill. Not the kind of smoke you got from a fire, of course. This was soft and translucent, like the smoke you saw when your mom made soup. "I knew it! I knew if we stayed past dark we'd see something." Harold thought the glow was cool, but it wasn't really proof of anything. For all they knew, that's where she kept her TV, and she was just watching something weird. Maybe she was down there smoking the stuff that he caught his sister puffing on behind the house, and they were watching no more than her relaxing after a long day of being terrible. Either way, the glow wasn't much proof of anything. "We need to get closer," someone said. It wasn't until Harold found the other three looking at him that he realized he had been the one to say it. "That's a great idea," Davy said, putting down his binoculars. He looked pretty excited about the prospect of sneaking up on the old woman's house, but Harold suddenly wished he hadn't said anything. Mrs. Renfro's house was creepy enough in the daytime, and the idea of going over her fence at night was a little too spooky for him. "It was just a thought, guys. If she caught us sneaking over there after dark, she'd have we can go out the back and creep around the side of the house," Davy said, clearly not listening. "My mom'll never hear the door and think we've just gone up to my room if she comes downstairs." Stephen and Ralph were all for it, though Harold thought Ralph looked a little queasy. Just to be safe, they all went running up the stairs like a herd of gazelles to get their flashlights from their backpack. They had all brought them with the idea of telling scary stories later that night. But they might be put to better use now. Once they had them, they snuck back downstairs as quietly as they could and managed to make their way out the back door. There was still a little stab of daylight left as they came through Davy's backyard and around the front of the house. As they crossed the street in a mad hustle, it dipped below the horizon and left them in darkness, at least until the street lights came on in a small flurry of snapping bulbs. They stood beneath one of the lamplights, crouching low as they observed the front of Mrs. Renfro's house. The front lawn was covered in tall grass and weeds, children's toys dotting it like pirate treasure. From behind all the tall grass, they could see the green glow as it came from the small windows. The boys hopped the low fence as they snuck through the hip-high grass and up to the windows. As they lay on their bellies and looked down through those slats, Harold could see that Mrs. Renfro was not, in fact, watching TV and relaxing after a long day. What they saw seemed to be better proof that she was a witch. The basement looked identical to the one in Harold's house. A single steep staircase ran down into a concrete room with shelves and hooks on the wall. The floor, a flat sheet of concrete. Instead of a washer, a dryer, and a mound of holiday decorations, however, a large metal pot sat in the middle of the floor. The pot, more like a bathtub than a soup pot, was the source of the green glow, and the liquid inside swirled with eldritch light. Mrs. Renfro was stirring it with a long spoon or maybe a broom handle, and though her mouth was moving, none of them could tell what she was saying. On a shelf near the pot was the cat they had seen her bring in a few days before. "Holy crap," whispered Ralph, pushing away from the window. "She really is a witch." Harold nodded, all of them moving back from the window so she couldn't see them. But Davy stayed put. He was focused on that cat, the one on the shelf that she was clearly planning to do something with. Harold didn't really like how intent he was. Davy was prone to doing things that weren't strictly smart sometimes, things that might be considered noble if they weren't so suicidal. Last summer, Davy had saved a kid from drowning at Gopher Pond, an act that had almost sent him under as well. The year before, he had shoved a kid out of the way of a truck, earning himself a broken arm and a commendation from the mayor. Davy didn't lack for courage. Sometimes he lacked for sense, though. When he picked up the rock, Harold was afraid that he might throw it through the little window and give them away. Instead, he rolled like a log and tossed it at Miss Renfro's front door. The old woman stiffened, climbing down off her stool as she hobbled towards the stairs on her gouty legs. "What are you doing?" Harold whispered, looking at Davy incredulously. "Getting that cat," Davy said. As she got to the top of the stairs, he pushed the window and grinned as it popped inward. He slid inside as Ralph began to hyperventilate, and Stephen asked what the heck he thought he was doing. Harold whispered he didn't know, but quieted as the front door came open and a quavery voice cascaded across the lawn. "Who is it?" she croaked, sounding more like a bullfrog than a woman. "What nasty beasties are taking me from my work?" The three boys got as low as they could in that tall grass, hoping it would cover them as the specter descended the steps. "Are you hiding?" she rasped, the stairs squeaking under her feet as her bunched old legs brought her closer to the yard. Harold put a hand over Ralph's mouth as his wheezing became louder. He undoubtedly needed his inhaler, but the sound of its trigger would alert the old biddy. Stephen had begun to shimmy a little, trying to get around the edge of the house, but as her patent leather shoe came down with a clump on the cobblestone path in front of her, he froze like a statue. If she had a flashlight, they'd be seen, but Harold didn't think she had one. She hadn't turned on the porch light either, and with any luck, her old eyes wouldn't see them if they stayed absolutely still. She took a step into the grass, and Harold almost pulled his hand away as he felt Ralph's tears touch his skin. She took another, and Harold thought she might be casting a spell before he realized it was just Stephen, quietly praying. She took a third step, and Harold shut his eyes tight as he hoped beyond hope that she wouldn't see them. The seconds slipped on for an indeterminate time, but finally she turned and hobbled back up the stairs. When the door closed, they all breathed a sigh of relief before pulling back to the window to see if Davy had been caught. Not only had Davy not been caught, but as they caught sight of him, he was lifting the cat carrier off the shelf. He had taken the stepladder that the witch had been standing on and was reaching on tiptoes to grasp the side of the cat carrier. None of them could hear if the cat was cooperating, but it didn't look as if Davy was going to manage to get the cage off the shelf without dropping it. Harold had just shimmied to go help him when the croak of the witch brought him up short and sealed Davy's fate. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" she screeched, and Davy must have jumped because he was suddenly falling towards the tub of glowing liquid. The cat carrier fell to the concrete with a smack, and a small white animal shot out like a cannonball as it tore off towards the upstairs. It ran right between the startled legs of the crone, but she was more interested in the boy that was now bobbing in her cauldron. They both began to scream simultaneously. Mrs. Renfro doubled over, falling down the stairs as she clutched at her stomach. She was still when she came to rest on the concrete, but Harold could see her twitching as whatever was happening took effect. The tub could not have been deeper than a foot or two, but Davy was suddenly splashing like a drowning man. He was shrinking, his skin growing taut and spotted, his hair growing gray and brittle. His teeth fell out, floating in the soup before dissolving into nothing. His eyes joined them, his skeletal hands still grasping at hope. As they watched, their friend shuddered out a last few moments of his life, his body dissolving as he sank into the tub. They ran screaming from the yard, thundering into Davy's house as they went to find the closest adult they could. The police were there before they could finish telling it all, and the 4 squad cars lit up the cul-de-sac like a Christmas light show. Harold's father was amongst them, being one of the deputies for their little town, which was how Harold found out more than he strictly wanted to the next day. Harold had gone home with his mother, Mrs. Parker speaking with the police as she begged them to find her son. He had gone to sleep on the couch under the scratchy afghan his mother had crocheted, and dreamed about the pool of liquid in Mrs. Renfro's basement. In the dream, Davy's skeleton had burst out of it as he stood beside the cauldron, grabbing him and trying to drag him in. It screamed and screamed, his ears ringing with it, and when he tossed and turned his way off the couch, he awoke to find his mother and father talking in the kitchen. Old Biddy was kinda nuts. She had all these books and diagrams, satanic stuff. She had this big tub of liquid down there. The coroner thinks it's acid or something, but they aren't really sure. He paused, and Harold almost heard the shudder in his father's voice. They found bone fragments at the bottom of the tub. They aren't sure, but they think they might be human. Did they find any sign of Davy? His mother asked. Not really. They can't be sure that the bone fragments are his, but if the boy's story's right, I guess they'd have to be. I hope that terrible woman rots in prison, his mother half whispered, expressing more venom in her words than Harold had ever heard from her before. Not unless we find her, he said unhappily. She was gone when we arrived. How far could she have gotten? She'd have to be pushing 100. I don't know, but the journals I found will stick with me for a long time. He shuddered a little, and Harold peeked around the corner of the couch to snoop on his parents. She was killing cats. She talked about how she would drown them in that tub and steal their lives. Steal their lives? Cats were supposed to have 9 lives. She was stealing their lives to stay alive. She was so delusional. She thought the cats were keeping her from dying. The journal entries went way, way back, long before you and I were born. She was a sick woman who believed she'd lived for centuries. Mrs. Renfro's house sat empty for a long time. The families that moved in never stayed for long. They always said the same thing. They told the realtor that the house was lovely, but they felt watched while they were there. The toys disappeared from the yard, reclaimed by their owners, but Harold and his friends never returned to that house again. Davy's family moved away a few months after his disappearance. His mother couldn't deal with the loss of her son, and his house was soon occupied by a new family. Time went on. Harold and his friends returned to school. People forgot about Davy and Mrs. Renfro. A news story began to circulate, though, as the stories always do. Kids claimed to see a young woman walking the streets at night. She would lure children away, singing to them and telling them how she wanted to play. She was said to be luring more than a few teens away as well, though Harold doubted she had offered to play with them. There were reports of people missing, but never enough to spark much panic. They could be chalked up to runaways or kids lost in the woods, and the town continued. Harold knew that they were more than stories, though. He saw the woman outside his window most nights, he and Stephen and Ralph. She called to them, telling them to come and play. She told them that Davy missed them, and they could see him again if they wanted. When they refused her or ignored her, she would go into the woods behind their houses, disappearing into the shadows. Sometimes they could see a strange green glow from the woods late at night. Harold wondered how many years Mrs. Renfro had gotten from Davy, and how many more she would get before the town finally put an end to her.
Let's hope you don't run afoul of anything like that the next time you happen to be in the woods. Speaking of running afoul of things, let's hear a story of repossession, though maybe not what you're thinking of. Let's follow a couple of guys on the job while they repossess something that they shouldn't have.
Poor guy seemed almost happy to be rid of it. Jack looked at the man framed in the window, turning away with some effort. He probably is, Jack said as we climbed into the cab of the truck. He stood at the window as we pulled away, just silently watching us drive up the road with his wife's Toyota Corolla. When the order came in today, I expected it would be one of the bad ones. Given the circumstances, the bank had extended his payment for as long as possible, but the time had finally come to call in their debt. I've been in repossession for about 3 years now. I work for a private outfit, Larkin Brothers, out of Atlanta, Georgia. In a city that size, you see a lot of unpaid car notes, so there's always business for a man in my line of work. I've seen a lot in my 3 years. I've had people attack my vehicle, pull guns on me, and try to drive cars off my truck after I've chained them in. This repossession, though, was definitely the most shocking thing I've ever seen. David Gursley had become something of a local celebrity after the disappearance of his wife, Evelyn. David was a heart doctor whose practice was frequented by many. He was touted as a miracle worker and had performed many complicated procedures that his colleagues refused to take on. He was well respected in the community and well liked by his patients. So when his wife had disappeared, David had not been at the top of the suspect list. We pulled out of the gated community and onto the main road. As the traffic cruised, I caught myself looking at the car in the rearview mirror as Jack made his way back to the lot. It was pristine, only having a few dings from the various adventures that Mrs. Gursley had taken it on. It was a wonder the wheels were still on it, given Evelyn's track record. If David Gursley was famous, then Evelyn Gursley was infamous. Evelyn was a staple in the Atlanta social scene. She was out every weekend, carousing, drinking, calling the local hospitals looking for David. She'd been in several tabloids, the papers bemoaning that such a man as David had such an embarrassment for a wife. David was no angel, of course. Their fights had been heated, her breakdowns epic, and if I was David Gursley, I think I'd have been relieved when she went missing. Looking in the rearview mirror as Jack drove, I did a double take and almost told him to pull over. I looked at it again, though, and shook my head as I saw nothing was there. I had been sure that I could see someone in the driver's seat, a woman with long blonde hair, almost as if the ghost of Evelyn Gursley had taken it for one last spin. "You okay, kid?" Jack asked, and I nodded as I looked out the window instead. I guess everyone was hoping to see Evelyn Gursley these days. David had reported her missing a few days after she'd left in her green Corolla, but she hadn't been officially classified as a missing person until they found her car by the side of the road. That had been about a month ago, and everyone was keeping an eye out for her, though most assumed that she was out on one of her typical benders. Evelyn did these sorts of things pretty frequently, after all, and it was expected that she would show up again after her credit card stopped working. We pulled into the lot, and the gate chugged shut behind us. I got out and helped Jack unload the car. The tires bounced a little as they hit the ground, and I could have sworn that something bumped inside the trunk. It didn't sound like the usual bump of a spare tire banging around, that semi-metal thunk of the rubber circle rebounding off of something. It made me want to open it up so I could investigate, but that was a big no-no. We were paid to bring the cars to the lot, not inspect them. That was a different department, and the boss didn't like it if the jumpsuits, as they called us, went rifling through the cars in impound. Besides, we had work to do. As we rode to the next stop, I couldn't help thinking about the car and the missing lady who had once driven around in it. Evelyn Gursley hadn't been officially missing till after her car had been found. It wasn't uncommon for Evelyn to just go off for days at a time, but she always sobered up and called her husband for money so she could get home. She'd been missing a few years ago, back when I was in high school, and I only remember it because the football team, of which I was a member, had gone out to help look for her. We had canvassed the area around their house, and the nearby bar she often drank at, and the surrounding woods where her car had been found. Her husband had come with us, and I talked with him a few times as we canvassed. I liked David. He was easy to talk to, and you could tell that despite how his wife acted sometimes, he loved her too. When she called him from South Florida after a week of being missing, he had wired her money for a plane ticket, and the search was called off. So when she had been reported missing this time, no one really expected much of it. She would call soon, maybe from Jamaica or New York, and he would send her money so that she could come home again. It was easy to roll your eyes at the pair, but I always kind of felt sorry for him. David Gursley did more pro bono work than any other surgeon in the state, and he was one of the most respected heart surgeons in his field. Were it not for his wife, he would have had nothing but that glowing reputation of his, but people loved to see someone fall. They always harked on the idea that he couldn't control his wife or her drinking problem. He had long ago stopped bringing her to large functions, but that hardly stopped her from showing up and making a scene. As we hooked the car to the ramp, the owner already shouting from the porch about getting his lawyer,
I wondered why he hadn't just divorced her to save himself from embarrassment. I suppose maybe he didn't want her to drink up half of his money, but that was only a guess. When we got back, Lisa was waiting for us on the curb. Lisa was our receptionist, a cute little dark-haired girl of Latin persuasion. She could be fiery, she could be feisty, but the look she wore now had me believing that she was about to turn pleading. Lisa was a good worker, but she didn't like going into the impound area if she could help it. The keys she was holding in her left hand made me think she was probably about to ask Jack or me to get a car for her, and I rolled my window down and told her to toss them in. She smiled. "You're a peach. It's the red Fiesta in 55. If you could bring it up while I do the paperwork, I'll buy you lunch sometime." I caught the keys and told her it was a date, as Jack and I rumbled into the impound. "You know when she says lunch, that's all she's talking about, right?" Jack asked, as the gate closed behind us. "Pfft, you don't know that. Maybe this is just how it starts." "Whatever, Casanova. Go make sure everything's ready for this puppy to roll off." I climbed out and went around the back, checking the leads and ensuring everything was ready for a smooth touchdown. As I watched the car begin to lower, a loud and unpleasant process, my eyes strayed to the green Corolla we had parked earlier. It looked kind of forlorn just sitting there, that faithful engine that had taken Mrs. Gersley to so many watering holes and mostly returned her safely home again. As I looked at it, something was dripping from the back of it. It was slowly dropping onto the sand and grass of the impound lot, and the drops were thick and viscous. It looked like radiator fluid, and I wondered if maybe we had broken something when we dropped it down. Maybe some chemicals or spare engine fluid? I was drawn back to reality as Jack yelled at me to get out of the way, the ramp missing me by an inch as I jumped back. I helped guide the car back, unhooking the chains when it was level, and Jack groused at me for daydreaming as I came back to the cab for the keys. I parked it in spot 68, and as I drove past the Corolla and Lisa's Fiesta, I was glad to see that the puddle had stopped growing. I didn't think about the Corolla again until Friday. I was getting ready to go get some lunch, Lisa prepared to make good on her promise, when my boss asked me to pull the Corolla from Dr. Gersley to the inspection bay. "Dealer wants to pick it up, and we need to get it inspected so they can have it." I nodded, grabbing the keys and heading into the lot to get the car. Inspections are mostly to ensure that we haven't screwed anything up when we were repoing it. That and any damage that the owner might have forgot to catalog. As I climbed in behind the wheel, I knew something was amiss at once. It had been hot the last couple of days, an absolute scorcher, and the car smelled like there might be rotten food in it somewhere. No, not food. More like someone had hit an animal and it had gotten knocked into the undercarriage. I cranked the car and rolled the windows down, powering through the task as I tried not to lose my appetite along the way. Marge was waiting for me, a stocky middle-aged mother of 3 who ran the detailing area, and she pinched her nose as she smelled the aroma through the window. "Jesus, what an odor!" "Yeah, kind of smells like roadkill. Maybe something in the undercarriage?" "I'll get it on the hoist and have a look. Thanks for bringing it to me." I waved at her as I moved off to meet Lisa by the front, and the two of us headed off to lunch. On that score, Jack had been right, but the real surprise was what was waiting for me when I walked back alone. Lisa had paid for lunch, but she had taken hers to go so she could run some errands with her boyfriend. Eating my barbecue basket took some of the sting out of the revelation, but it made the walk back by myself twice as pathetic. I had struck out again, but at least there were another 3 hours of work to keep my mind off of things, right? I had just stepped into the repo lot to look for Jack when someone screamed like they were being murdered. I saw Jack heading for the inspection bay on the run, and I was right behind him as another scream shivered into the afternoon sky. It was Marge, and it appeared she had found the terrible smell. It hadn't been roadkill, or even old food, but it had solved the mystery of what had befallen Evelyn Gersley. The corpse had been in the trunk, its flesh mostly liquefied by now, and the face stared out at us from 2 empty pits. The eyes were gone, the face eaten by bugs until the skull peeked out, but it was nowhere near as grisly as the wound on her chest. Someone had cut her chest open, and the place where her heart should be gleamed wetly from her putrefied flesh. The cops came quickly when we told them that we believed we had found Evelyn Gersley in the trunk of a car we had repoed. They questioned all of us, wanting to know everything we had seen since we took the car. It didn't take long for David Gersley to be taken into custody. The cops confided in me that he hadn't fought them. It was like he was just waiting for us to come find him. Over the next few days, the details came out in the news, shedding some light on why the beloved David Gersley had murdered his wife. Evelyn had caught him cheating, that much was known, but the two had seemed to reconcile. Evelyn hadn't wanted to leave. She had the best possible life, and with David's money, she could continue to drink and cavort as she chose. Then, David had met Linda Smalls, and things had changed. Linda was a pillar of the community. She organized charity events, worked to set up soup kitchens, clothing drives, raised 5 boys, and became the breadwinner for her home when her husband's stroke last year had left him partially paralyzed. She helped so many, but it seemed that no one would be there to help her when she needed it. No one besides David Gersley. David had been following her case, hoping to find a proper donor for her. She had some rare blood type, the same blood type as Evelyn, come to find out, but the two couldn't be more different. David tried his best to find her a donor, but as her time grew closer, he realized she wasn't going to find a new heart in time. Not unless he took some drastic measures. He cut out his wife's heart, using the skills he had developed over years of doing the same for patients, and donated it to Linda Small anonymously. The revelation had caused a lot of stress in Linda Small, but she's taken the opportunity to do work with the sacrifice that he made for her. I think back on that every now and again, telling the new guys about it now that it's my turn to drive the truck since Jack retired last year. From then on, the boss made it a rule to check the trunks of the cars before we left them in the lot. All vehicles are searched for anything suspicious before we sign off on them, so that nothing like this happens again. We're more careful now, but I doubt we'll ever encounter a situation that weird again. Least, I sure as hell hope not. Whew. After last night's hard rain, sure is a good thing I brought wood in early. That way, the stuff I've got out there on the pile can have time to dry. So, it'll be ready for tomorrow's Cozy Tales. Speaking of tales that may not be so cozy, let's talk about a writer's journey as he realizes that maybe he's written something he shouldn't have. Let's hear a story called We Have to Stop This. We have to stop this. All of this. We have to stop writing, we have to stop reading, and we have to stop spreading these things around. As I sit here in my 1-bedroom apartment, I can feel him looking at me. He's closer now. I can see him pacing in the corner. When he sees what I'm writing, I'm not sure what will happen. I've been writing these stories, these things, for so long. I've polluted the world with this filth, but I'm done. These stories, these abominations have ruined my life, like no drug or drink ever could. After tonight, though, I guess I'll never have to think about them again. I don't want you to think it's always been this way. I haven't always been a worthless waste of space. I was married once. I was married to an amazing woman who loved me. We had a little boy. We had a new house. I had a job that I loved. We had friends. We went out. We had a life together. That was before I found the creepypastas. I've always been a fan of horror. Horror films, horror comics, horror stories. Pretty much anything scary. I remember when I was 6, I watched The Shining with my mom. While I didn't sleep at all that night, I remember relishing the squirming feeling that lived in my guts. From that day forward, I was hooked. I watched anything and everything. Even cheesy films like Paranormal Activity or The Haunting of Sunshine Girls seemed to pique my adrenaline. The darker the movie, the more it appealed to me. I guess that's why I liked them so much. If I was afraid, then my adrenaline was pumping, and it made me feel more alert, more alive. Horror movies are how I met my wife, Lisa. We were both standing in line at the midnight showing of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and began talking about horror movies as we waited to get our tickets. By the time we got inside, her friends had called to cancel, and I invited her to come sit with me. She was so cute, but turned out to be a total scaredy cat. She spent most of the movie hiding her eyes and squeezing my hand during the best parts. I didn't mind, though. I think I was in love by the end of that movie. 6 months later, we moved in together. To my surprise, we meshed well together. We didn't have the usual arguments over dinner or the division of chores. The house was brighter with her in it, and on our first anniversary, I proposed to her, and we made it official. My one-bedroom condo, our one-bedroom condo, I guess, was fine for a while, but when she told me she was pregnant, I knew it was time to find a bigger place. I do IT work for a pretty big company, so money for a house wasn't too big of an issue. With our modest incomes, we were able to get a nice 3-bedroom house in the city, and I put my condo up for rent. When our son was born, I thought it was the happiest day of my life. For a while, we were the picture of a happy family. Little did I know how quickly that would end. About 2.5 years ago, just as my son turned 2, a friend of mine told me about a new game on Steam called Five Nights at Freddy's. He knew I liked horror games, and he bought it for me as a late birthday present. I gave it a thorough playthrough, and though it was kind of cheesy, I felt like it was still an okay experience. The game, however, opened up a door I wished I'd left closed. I was so taken with the mystery of the game, the Bite of 82, the animatronics, the missing children, and it led me to search online for more info. That's how I stumbled across the creepypastas. They were great. How had I never seen these before? They were terrifying in a way I hadn't seen in years. I started with a classic, 1999, which was recommended because of the main character from the FNAF games, a giant bear. From the first time I read the story, I felt like there was something about it, something different. It prickled the hairs on the back of my neck, to be sure, but it also felt like something was watching me. I shrugged it off, just that scared feeling, like when you watch a really intense horror movie, and for a day or so afterwards you feel on edge. I spent the next few months engrossed in any creepypasta I could find. Jeff the Killer, Slender Man Legends, Smile Dog, Candle Cove, that one was one of my favorites. The Blue Man, all the SCPs. After a while, I'm ashamed to say that they became a bit of a mania in me, and I absorbed anything that I could lay my hands on. When I learned that there were several channels on YouTube that read them aloud, I instantly subscribed to as many as I could find. I would eat through months, years of archives in one sitting, and with my headphones on, I felt immersed in a world of darkness that no horror movie could simulate. The creepypastas created a world in my mind that no Nightmare on Elm Street or House of a Thousand Corpses could rival. It seemed like, when I had time, I was always listening to them, ignoring anything else. That's when things started to get really bad. It started with insomnia. I was plagued with nightmares that would wake me up several times a night. I'd wake up, certain there was something in the bedroom with me, but a frantic sweep would find nothing except a grumpy wife being woken up yet again by my nightmares. It got to the point where I was lucky to get 5 hours of sleep a night, then 4 hours of sleep, then 2 if I was really lucky, then 2, but only if I took sleep aids or drank myself into oblivion. My wife made me go see a doctor. He put me on medication, but that didn't work either. Then, at her wit's end, she made me sleep on the couch. That only escalated my night terrors, though. That feeling of being watched got worse and worse, and I started seeing something out of the corner of my eye as I listened to my stories. As I sat awake, using the fear to keep myself from nightmares, I would see the shadowy something as it huddled in the corner. It would creep closer and closer, just out of my sight, but always in the peripherals, until I'd snap my head around, and it would vanish. I started having trouble at work. I was always tired and short with my coworkers. One day the boss told me just to not bother coming back. My wife was furious, finally told me that it was my family or the scary stories. We argued, but my heart really wasn't in it. I, too, had come to understand by then that the stories were the problem. The stories were keeping me awake. The stories were keeping me amped up. The stories were making me paranoid. I needed to work. I needed to be a father. So I did the only thing that made any sense. I gave them up, cold turkey, at least for a while. I lasted all of 2 months. Without the stories, I started to slip back into a normal routine. I was getting to sleep on time. My job let me come back on a trial period that quickly became permanent. My attitude improved, and I was once again the man I had always been. It's funny, though, how we forget what set us down the bad path once we're back in the light. It was just a little bit at first, on my phone at work, then after my wife went to bed, or when I was on the toilet, and slowly the night terrors came creeping back in. I had relapsed hard, and before I knew it, I was listening to them all the time again. That's when my wife took our son and left for her mother's house. The nightmares got worse, and suddenly I wasn't sleeping at all. My temper would flare unexpectedly, and that was the last straw for my newly returned job. My friends tried to help me, but I became moody and unpredictable. Soon they stopped coming around too. I started drinking again, drinking to black out, to feel a few moments of blissful oblivion. My wife filed for divorce, unable to help me, and unwilling to watch me kill myself with these stupid stories. My parents stopped calling, agreeing with my wife that if I wouldn't stop on my own, they didn't want anything to do with me. Then, one day, I realized the stories were all I had left. Or so I thought. About a year ago, the stories weren't enough. I could see the thing in the corner of my eye more and more often, stalking me. One day, for no reason at all, I started writing my own stories. I'd never been a writer, far from it, but the act of writing worked as its own kind of talisman against the creature. Writing them seemed to keep them at bay, seemed to get the darkness out of me. And for a while, things got better. I was getting 5 hours of sleep again. I was feeling better than I had in a long time, but the writing became just as much of a mania as the reading. The divorce proceedings went badly for me. She got the house, of course, and child support, and a lot of other things I would have fought for once. I didn't care. None of it mattered to me. All I cared about was the thing in the corner of the courtroom that kept growling and pacing. All I wanted to do was get this over with so I could get home to my writing. I moved out, went back to the condo we used to live in, and took odd jobs to keep the bills paid. I've sold blood, sperm, written terrible things for terrible people, and all to feed my addiction. I'm no better than some smack addict, no better than some worthless junkie who writes his fix every day. My wife keeps calling me, asking when I plan to see our son, who keeps asking where his daddy is. But I don't have time for them. I have to write. I have to keep this beast at bay. But now, even the writing has stopped working. The thing isn't in the corner of my eye anymore. I can see him now. He's not even trying to hide. I'm afraid that he's very close to having me. God forgive me. He's stalking forward right now, and I can see his paws or feet or whatever they are as they make little divots in the carpet. I can smell his rancid breath as he grins with his lipless mouth full of teeth. So, what's the point of this then? Why write a creepypasta about creepypastas? For some kind of macabre immortality within a world I once loved? To have one more hurrah before the end? No. I'm writing this for you, for the ones who may be reading this after I'm gone. Always remember, if you remember nothing else, that these tales are spun from darkness. That the thing you feel watching you when you create fear is real. It can and will get you if you let it. While you stare long into the abyss, know that it stares hungrily back at you. His face is inches from my throat now. I can finally identify the brimstone in his breath. I think my time might be up.
Whew, starting to think about lunchtime. This next story's got me a little bit hungry. It is about that time of day, though, I suppose. So, I suppose it's maybe time to break for a little snack. But, while you enjoy a tasty snack, let's hear about an unfortunate cookie.
The usual lunch special, Charles?
Yeah, Damien, but no crab rangoon this time. Trying not to eat so many carbs. Whatever you say, dude, Damien said, ringing him up. To say that Charles ate a lot of Chinese food probably wouldn't put his problem in perspective. Charles had been lucky when the pandemic hit. He was a work-from-home computer tech who rarely left his house anyway, so working on projects from his apartment was pretty par for the course. He'd been getting lunch at Damien's for the better part of 8 years, and they had the best Chinese food within walking distance of his bungalow. Though COVID had put an end to him dining in, it hadn't stopped Charles from getting his fix. Quite the contrary, it had only made it worse. Charles ordered from Damien's 3 times a day. Breakfast was egg drop soup and early morning rice at 10. Lunch was General Tso chicken, around 2 o'clock. Dinner was beef and broccoli with house soup and salad at 10, and was also the last delivery that Damien's made for the day. Charles honestly couldn't remember the last time he had cooked a meal for himself, and it just seemed easier to buy takeout. His programming job paid way more than he needed, especially after a lot of his coworkers had quit, and Charles was enjoying his shut-in lifestyle. When he heard the knock on his door, he rolled away from his keyboard and went to get his lunch. It was the short, dark-haired guy this time, the one who looked a little like Bruce Wayne. He didn't speak a lot of English, and Charles told him thanks as he took his food inside. Damien's only had about 3 delivery guys. The nerdy Bruce Wayne was the one who delivered most often. Charles had been hoping it would be Roger, though, the brown-haired Chad who liked to talk about Warhammer. But it appeared he'd have to wait till dinner time to see how he'd placed in last week's tournament. As a shut-in, Charles often had to live vicariously through those who braved the outside world. As Charles looked through the bag, ensuring everything was in there, he smiled as he saw his favorite part of the meal towards the bottom. It was silly, but Charles found that he really looked forward to those buttery yellow little cookies with the fortunes inside. He knew they were far from authentic cuisine, but he liked the cookies ever since he was a kid. Charles had about 100 of the fortunes pinned up on a corkboard, and sometimes he liked to read them and think about their meanings on days he'd gotten them. Had he found someone new when he got that fortune? Had he found untold fortune on that particular day? Looking at them so often was probably why he had noticed the phone number. Want more cookies? Call 1-800-555-2665. He had never really thought about it before. It was probably the number for the restaurant to resupply their fortune cookies. The fact that it appeared on the fortunes, something that were inside the cookies, was a little strange. How would the restaurant get the number if they handed out the cookies? It didn't really make sense for the people eating the cookies to need more cookies. And as Charles sat the food on his desk, he opened the cookie and fished out the fortune as he munched on the little cookie shell. Today, you will make a hasty decision that will change your life. Damn, Charles thought, that one was different. It seemed benign on the surface. Everyone made decisions that changed their life, didn't they? The message wasn't the weird part, though. It was the sinister undertones that Charles couldn't quite shake. Not just any decision, but a hasty one. He ate the other half of the cookie before adding this one to the corkboard, looking at the phone number that sat under the lucky numbers. Want more cookies? Call 1-800-555-2665. Charles grinned, turning back to his desk as he opened the rest of his food and began to eat. Who wouldn't want more cookies? Charles worked well into the night. By 11, he had fixed the problem in the code his boss had sent him. One of the other coders had been a little sloppy in the parameters, and as a result had caused the program to crash as often as it returned anything usable. Charles had fixed it, emailing his boss about 10, and had started bumming around on Reddit as he thought about what to do with the rest of his evening. He wasn't ready to turn in yet, but he wasn't really interested in any of the games he had in his Steam library. He was just kind of wasting time as he scrolled through Reddit when he came to a weird post about strange phone numbers. The poster was talking about how he had called a number he'd found and how the guitar instructor had turned out to be a real creep. They claimed he had later seen the man on America's Most Wanted, but Charles thought the last bit sounded like bullshit. The comments mostly agreed, but some of them had talked about other weird numbers they had called. Massage parlors that had turned out to be brothels, contractors that had later robbed the house they had renovated, weird number stations that called back when you hung up, everything in between. The more he read, the more Charles thought about the number on the fortune cookie. It couldn't hurt to call. Maybe it would even give him a cool story to tell the strangers on the internet. He walked over to the board, cell phone clutched in hand, as he read that old familiar legend again. Want more cookies? Call 1-800-555-2665. Charles dialed the number in that stilted way that people do when they dial a new number. He had to go back and try it again after putting the number in wrong the first time, and when it started ringing, Charles assumed that a machine would get it. They would probably just bury him in a phone tree, and he would never actually talk to a real person. Either that, or the number would ring twice and then tell him it had been disconnected. They had probably had these cookies out for a while, and the number would have changed or been liquidated altogether. The third ring had barely started when a bored-sounding woman picked up the phone. Hello? Charles blinked, and the woman had said hello once more before he finally shook it off and answered her. Yeah, I was calling about the cookies. Wonderful. We'll send them right out. Don't you need my address or my... No, sir, it's all taken care of. Thank you for your call. Then she hung up, and Charles was left staring out into space. Well, that had been weird, he thought. He figured it might be time to get ready for bed. The phone call had weirded him out, and he had another long day tomorrow. As he snugged down under his covers, he couldn't help but glance over at the fortunes on the corkboard. He wondered how long it would take them to send the cookies to his house. Would they send them all at once, or would this be a situation where they sent a few at a time? He fell asleep dreaming of the buttery little fortune cookies, and when he woke up, he decided that he must still be dreaming. His hands wrapped around the plastic film of a single fortune cookie, and as he opened it, he could smell the flaky aroma of the pastry inside. When he broke it open and felt the crumbs fall onto his chest, he opened his eyes and realized that it was no dream. The fortune cookie was tucked under his pillow, as if the tooth fairy had left him a buttery treat instead of a quarter. Charles looked at the fortune as he ate and was surprised to find not a fortune, but a thank you note. Thank you for your business. That was when he remembered the phone call from the night before. It was weird, but he couldn't see how the two could be connected. He must have just imagined eating the fortune cookie last night. Charles had no idea how it had gotten in his bed, but it was a nice surprise, nonetheless. He put in a call to Damien's, and when he sat down on the couch, the phone ringing as someone no doubt ran to grab it, he heard the crinkle of cellophane from under the couch cushions. Reaching under the cushion, Charles found another wrapped cookie, this one slightly broken from being sat on. "Hello? Charles, you ordering?" Damien's voice brought Charles back to reality, and he munched on the cookie as he placed his morning order. He was soon eating his breakfast, the cookie out of his mind, but he would think back on that day and decide that that had been the first appearance of the strange cookies. The next day, Charles found 12 individually wrapped cookies. They were all scattered around the apartment. They were tossed haphazardly around, some under the couch, some as far as the kitchenette. Charles couldn't exactly put them off as something he'd forgotten or misplaced. How had they gotten so spread across the living room? Then his eyes fell on a small takeout bag in the trash, and he felt like he knew the answer. Roger had delivered his food this morning, and he remembered telling him about the number he'd called to get more cookies. Roger had said it sounded a little spooky, and told him to let him know when the cookies arrived. Charles had gone to get his wallet so he could pay him, leaving Roger at the door. That must have been when he'd tossed the cookies into his house, probably thinking he was being funny. Charles nodded as he collected up the cookies, the explanation reassuring him until he remembered that it was almost time for dinner. Roger had delivered his food around 11, so how did Charles not notice the cookies for 8 hours? He put it out of his mind as he picked up the phone so he could order his dinner. The next day, Charles found 20 of the cookies scattered around his house again. Not all at once, of course. Charles had sat down to eat his breakfast when he found the first one under the couch. Then he stumbled across the line of 10 or 12 cookies stretched over the couch and to the far side of the kitchenette. They looked tossed haphazardly, and he gritted his teeth as he imagined Roger smirking as he covertly threw a handful of cookies into the apartment. He picked up one of the cookies, preparing to call Damien's and tell Roger how he'd gotten him good, when he remembered that Roger hadn't delivered his meal this morning. Roger wouldn't be there till noon today, and the other guy hadn't even known about the number. But if it wasn't Roger, then who else could it be? He tried to put it out of his mind, but when he found 4 more in the bathroom sink and 3 more in his bedroom, it was harder to overlook. He found more in the bathtub, but by then any thought that it might be a joke was over. None of the delivery guys could have gotten this far into his apartment. He was more confused than scared, but Charles really wanted some answers. When he called to place his lunch order, he was surprised to find Dianne answering the phone again. Surprised, but not unhappy. "The usual?" Dianne asked, and Charles could already hear his pencil scratching. "Yeah, but I got a question." "We don't do discounts for frequent customers," Dianne joked, but he must have heard something he didn't like in Charles's voice. "No, nothing like that. I was wondering about where you get your fortune cookies from." "My uncle orders them. Why do you ask?" "Well, I recently started finding them around my house. It was just a few yesterday, but they were all over the house today. I found 20 of them so far, and the fact that no one's been in my house since right after COVID started is a little..." But Dianne cut him off. The usual good-natured ribbing was gone. Charles believed that this was the most serious he'd ever heard Dianne. "You called the numbers on the cookies, didn't you?" Charles' mouth went dry as he heard Dianne get to the point. "Yeah, but I haven't gotten any cookies delivered. They just keep appearing in my house. I don't understand how this is happening, but I want to know how they're getting in." He was silent for a few seconds, and Charles thought he had hung up. When he spoke, Charles suddenly wished he had. You can't stop it. There's no taking it back once the deal is made. He hung up on Charles then, and they refused to take his calls. Charles was on his own, it seemed. On the third day, Charles found his couch covered in cookies, and he estimated there were about 50 in all. That was when Charles called the police. They came out and checked the house, but they couldn't find any sign of entry. Charles showed them the cookies, telling them how they had just appeared in the middle of the night, but he could tell they didn't believe him. They thought he was playing a joke, one at their expense, too, and they clearly didn't appreciate it. They told him they would look into it and to call back if it happened again, but Charles figured they would be another group that would ignore his phone calls. He tried to call Damien again, but no one picked up. He locked all the doors before bed, ensuring every window was secured, and checked every point of entry. He had told himself the night before that if it kept happening, he would get the landlord to change the locks. How else could they be getting in? This had to be a trick. Someone had too much time and they wanted to play a trick on him. Whether they were pranksters or not, Charles wanted this to stop. Charles lay on the couch, all the cookies swept into a pile in the corner, and hoped they would just be gone when he woke up in the morning. He awoke to find the floor of his apartment covered in the little yellow cookies. They crackled angrily as he set his feet down on them, and when he stood up, they were up to his ankles. As he trudged through them, he saw they covered the floor from the living room to the bedroom. The bathroom door opened with some pushing, and as he waded through them so he could use the toilet, Charles was racked with a sudden wave of angry coughs. He felt something tickle at the back of his throat, and was certain for half a second that he was going to throw up. His urine trickled to the floor as he hit his knees, and when the thing splashed into the toilet, Charles felt something cold squirm in his guts. The cookie floated in the filthy water like a strange buoy in an alien sea. As he watched it bob there, Charles made a decision that would change the rest of his short life. He slid his shoes on and left the house for the first time in months. The bell rang as he walked into Damien's, and the staff's smiling faces curdled as they saw him. Charles sat at the table he had taken every time he had eaten here. The staff went about their jobs, actively avoiding him, but Charles wasn't going anywhere. He knew that Damien had answers. He knew something, and he'd sit here until he got what he was after. Even if it was Damien telling him how exquisitely screwed he was going to get some answers. Damien let him sit there for close to an hour, before finally coming out. "I told you there was nothing I could do. You've been cursed. Don't you understand that? The least you could do is not spread it around." "You know something about this, though," Charles said, glaring at him from between his steepled fingers, "and I'm not leaving until I get some answers." Damien turned his head away, seeming to think about it, before finally telling Charles to wait. "Without you calling in an order at 10, I can finally close this place up on time. Wait till then, order whatever you want, and I'll take you to someone who has answers." Charles scoffed. "I can't just sit here all day." Damien only shrugged. "If you want answers, then I guess you'll have to." With little choice but to wait, Charles ordered some lunch. The staff kept his drink full, and Damien was true to his word. Charles ate when he was hungry, drank when he was thirsty, and used their facilities sparingly. He couldn't help but imagine his poor apartment as it filled up with the buttery little cookies, and the longer he sat, the more anxious he became. Where was Damien taking him later? Who would explain the situation? Someone else who had called the number? As the sun set behind him, Charles wanted to go with him less and less, but knew that he needed to more and more. As the crowds faded and the restaurant emptied, Damien finally came out and told him it was time to go. "We can take my car," he said, indicating a small hatchback out front. The car ride was short. They drove a few streets towards a small cluster of family homes that ended in a cul-de-sac. Charles could see several people wave at Damien as he drove towards the house at the end of the turnabout, and the sight of that place made him a little wary. Where the others had well-maintained lawns and houses that looked well-kept, this house they stopped in front of looked old and ready to fall down. The grass was mostly sand, patchy and limp, and the front porch was covered in boxes that looked ready to be shipped. The place looked abandoned, like a hoarder's house, but Charles could see people coming and going through the front door, most of them carrying boxes like the one on the porch. Damien killed the engine and looked at Charles. "You sure you want to know? It won't change your fate." Charles nodded, unable to damn himself with his words, and Damien climbed out and set off towards the house. Charles followed meekly enough after, but it wasn't until he got to the porch that he realized what those boxes were. He didn't need to read the foreign characters to know what was inside. The open box contained a bunch of familiar yellow cookies that Charles had come to hate.
Whoever owned this house was packaging the fortune cookies in boxes. When Damien opened the door, a cascade of wrapped fortune cookies slithered onto the porch. "It's even worse than usual," Damien mumbled, wading into the sea of cookies as he beckoned Charles forward. The inside was even worse. The house was full of boxes, and the pair had to wade through the hip-deep sea of fortune cookies. Charles could see others wading through them, shoving them into boxes as they took them out. Charles could see a kitchen and a den as they waded through the house, and Damien seemed to be leading him towards the back. As they made their way down a hallway towards the back bedroom, the cookies got thicker and thicker. Damien knocked on the door, calling out a name Charles didn't understand. "Uncle?" Damien asked, a strange gurgling coming from inside. "Uncle, I got a guest who wants to meet you. May we come in?" There was another gurgling response, and Damien invited Charles inside. Charles was surprised to find not a room full of cookies, but a neat and tidy bedroom. Inside was an elderly man in striped pajamas, his dark hair plastered against his skull, and his unreadable eyes floating dully in his wrinkled face. His sallow skin clung to his bones like a bleached corpse, and if he hadn't turned to acknowledge Damien, Charles would have thought he was dead. "Good to see you again, Uncle," Damien greeted him. "This is my uncle, Dallin. He once owned the restaurant that I own now, but he made a miscalculation. He was trying to cut costs, and when he saw that he could get more cookies by calling the number, he gave it a try. At first it was wonderful. Dallin had enough cookies to stock the store for months, and he was glad for the windfall. Soon the cookies started taking over his house, though. They covered the floors, they crept up to the ceiling, they spilled into the yard, and finally they started filling him, too." The words sent a chill through Charles, but he had to be sure of what he was hearing. "When you say they filled him, what do you—" Dallin coughed suddenly, deeply, a racking cough that shook his whole body. Charles took a step towards the sick man, but Damien put a hand out to stop him. The old man crossed his arms over his chest, trying to steady himself, and bent low over the comforter. As the coughs became thick, Charles thought the old man meant to bring something up. Then he lunged forward suddenly. Charles watched as a cascade of cellophane-wrapped cookies fell onto the bedspread. He began to tremble, just like the one he had brought up earlier that day. "So," Charles said, having to swallow a mouthful of spit, not having the moisture to speak more than a few words. "So I'll start doing that too?" Damien nodded, putting a hand on his shoulder. "I'll have some of my people come over to pick up the cookies they leave behind. We can pay you for them, hopefully making it a little easier for you. Eventually we can bring you here. You can live in comfort for however long you have left, but eventually you'll be no different than my uncle here." Charles stood for a minute, unable to come to terms with what he was seeing. He wanted to deny what Damien had said. He wanted to tell him how it just couldn't be real, but then his body was consumed with vicious coughs, as if to prove how real it was. A single cookie pattered to the floor at his feet, and Charles realized it was already too late. One more story for you, and then I think it's time to transition from lunchtime into nap time. But don't be too upset. I've saved one of the best for last. It's a summer story about a bunch of kids out on a camping trip who find something unexpected in the woods. So let's hear about something that lies under the Trestle Bridge. It was just supposed to be another camping trip, like so many others we had gone on before. The town we live in isn't huge, but it does have a lot of woodland to explore. We live on the edge of what most people call Appalachia, and we've had more than one weird experience out in the woods. Once, as my friends and I walked down a familiar trail, we smelled a strong and unpleasant scent. Brian thought it must be a bear, but I'd smelled bears before. We'd had one winter under our back porch one year, and this was very different than the musty smell he had left come spring. Another time, while we were camping, we saw ghost lights in the woods. They were beautiful, red and blue and yellow and orange, and though Justin was afraid of them, I
felt drawn to go and see them so I could see them better. I knew better, though. Grandma had told me all about the dangers of following the ghost lights, and had assured us all that we wouldn't like where they took us.
The land of fairies is beautiful, but also terrible for mortals to behold. They would make you young for the rest of your days, though that might not be as long as you might think, she always said with an evil grin. We'd heard whistling and strange growls, throaty yells and strange birds, but none of it ever really scared me. The woods had always been a friendly place, a place of adventure, and I always looked forward to my time there. I never felt uneasy when I was within its borders, and as the four of us prepared to go back into the woods for another camping expedition, I was excited. Brian's brother had told us about an old trestle bridge deep in the woods, and we all wanted to see it. It was part of the old railroad, something that hadn't run through the town in a long time. The tracks were still there, the old station too, but the trains had mostly been for passengers, and we had none these days. No one came in, no one left, and we had no industry for the trains to transport. All the wood we harvested went to the sawmill or the paper mill, and there was no need to transport it by rails. The trestle bridge hadn't seen a train cross in 20 years. It spanned a small gorge in the middle of the forest. Brian said his brother had claimed the bridge was where high school kids went to drink beer, and now that we were freshmen, we should go out there too. He said it was a rite of passage, and that we should go see if the right had decided to leave us a gift out there. We didn't know what sort of gift that would be, but we were all curious to see the bridge. So we told our parents that we were going camping one weekend in April and took to the woods. Brian and I were eager, talking about how cool it would be to see the bridge, but Justin and Frank seemed hesitant. Well, that wasn't quite true. Justin was hesitant, as he almost always was, and Frank was kind of ambivalent. We had met Frank last year at the start of 9th grade, and he had made a pretty good addition to our trio. Frank wasn't an avid hiker, but he liked to hang out in the woods and get a little high from time to time, and that was good enough for us. He also brought outstanding camp snacks, so we were more than happy to hit the trail with him. I wasn't certain there was a sleeping bag in that rucksack of his, but I could already hear the crinkle of chips and snack cakes within it. Any idea how far this bridge is? Justin asked, plodding along grumpily. Justin didn't mind hiking, but he wasn't big on aimlessly wandering in the woods. He had packed enough to make up for Frank's lack of gear, and the tent poked over his left shoulder. He was plodding along at the back of the group, and I was sure we'd have to listen to a fair amount of complaints before we got there. My brother says it's about 3 miles into the woods, following the river until we come to the gorge. After that, it should be pretty easy to find. And if your brother's playing a trick on us, if he's just, messing with us, and we walked for 3 hours into the woods for nothing? Brian rolled his eyes. Then we have a fun little adventure to talk about when we go to college, don't we? Justin grumbled about having to walk 3 miles into the woods, but he couldn't have picked a better day for it. The weather was perfect, a slight breeze keeping the early summer heat at bay. The clouds overhead looked a little wet, but they were nowhere close. We'd have a nice camping trip this weekend, a nice little excuse to fish and relax and enjoy ourselves as we explored the old trestle. The woods around the town were full of things like that, and we'd explored old houses that had been retaken by the underbrush or abandoned vehicles that sagged amongst the leaves. When we were in the 7th grade, we even found an old concrete culvert out there that led into an underground cave that looked a little spooky in the light of our flashlights. The farther we walked, however, the less certain I was that the clouds wouldn't be a problem. The deeper into the woods we went, the more the smell of rain surrounded us. Brian smelled it too, and our pace increased as we kept heading deeper in. Maybe it was just a little rain. Maybe it was just a short downpour, and maybe we could get past it before it soaked everything.
When we came to the gorge and I saw the rising skeletal edifice of the trestle, I breathed a sigh of relief. "There she is, boys," Brian said, sounding surprised to have found it at all. "Looks pretty wrecked," Frank said, tossing a stub of cigarette into the gorge. "We aren't actually gonna go up on that thing, are we?" "Well, yeah," Brian said. "That's kind of the only reason we came here, wasn't it?" "You might, but I don't care what kind of surprise is up there," Frank said. "I ain't going." He had plenty of time to rethink his statement. Just because we had found the gully didn't mean we had made it to the trestle. The closer we got, the more I could see that for its age, it really was in amazing shape. It was less skeletal than I had thought, and looked more like a covered metal bridge. The underside of the trestle was a dark cave, the shadows thick and deep, and I really didn't want to explore the underside unless we really had to. Something about it made me uncomfortable, and as we got closer and closer to the base, the whole thing seemed to grow. It was mid-afternoon when we finally made it, and Brian let his pack fall as he set about climbing at once. You don't want to set up camp first?" Justin asked, taking out his tent and tools for making fire. "I just want to see the woods from up there," Brian said, looking at me as if to ask if I was coming. I let my pack slide off too, and we climbed the side of the trestle side by side. We were laughing as the ground got further and further away, the girders lifting us above the trees until we finally crested the top and came to the old tracks of the railroad. I was full of wonder as I looked out over the woods, the trestle spanning the entire gorge before slanting back down to the woods again. From up here, the clouds looked very dark, and I wondered if the tent would be enough to keep us from getting wet. "Check this out," Brian said, dangling his feet over the edge as he looked down into the gorge. Watching him made me slightly dizzy, and I didn't dare join him on the precipice. When he came back up, however, he had a rope with him and nodded me over to help him pull it up. It wasn't really heavy, but we were careful not to let it get stuck on anything. Brian left me to pull so that he could look over the edge and reported that the rope was attached to an old red cooler. As it came up over the edge, I saw that the rope was attached to a handle, and the whole thing was the red of a kid's wagon left out in the sun. The box was ancient, the bystander of 1,000 summer outings, and there was something inside it. Brian opened the lid and smiled as he pulled out a lukewarm six-pack of Natty Ice, a brand I was passing familiar with. Dad, a staunch Budweiser man, had always shook his head and called it piss water when he saw that it was on sale. I figured for a bunch of kids who were barely old enough to buy beer, the price was probably right, though. I assumed that Brian's brother had put it here. He had told us where to find the trestle bridge, after all, and as Brian fished the note out from under them, my suspicion was confirmed. "Brian, this is a place where high schoolers have come to drink and hang out for generations. Our own mom and dad sat on this bridge and drank when they were in high school, and now it's your turn. I spotted you a sixer this time, but you'll have to bring your own next time. If you ever have extra, leave them in this cooler and then tuck the cooler under the trestle bridge. Also, don't go under the bridge. We think there might be a bear under there. Kevin." The thought of a bear so close to our campsite kind of scared me, but Brian brushed it off. "He's probably just messing with us. Want one?" he asked, popping the top as he offered me one. I hesitated. I'd never drank before, but I figured just one couldn't kill me. It was warm and tasted terrible, but it wasn't the worst thing I'd ever had. Brian drank his quick, laughing as he threw the can into the gorge far below. We watched it spiraling down, spilling the last few remaining drops before it clinked weakly at the bottom. As if in answer, there was a distant rumble of thunder, and from our vantage point, we saw the lightning crack in the distance. We were on a big metal structure with lightning coming in quick and rain already pattering lightly around us. "We better go," I said, Brian looking at the lightning as it rumbled again. He nodded, and we decided to run down the tracks rather than try to scale back down. It would mean doubling back, but it wouldn't be a long trip, and the thought of juggling the rest of the beers and trying to climb down sounded nuts. Brian was holding the four of them close as he ran, smiling to himself as he talked about showing them to the guys.
Justin's gonna flip, Brian said with an evil laugh. You know, he still won't even be around anyone who smokes because of that dumb dare pledge. He was right, too. Justin was furiously hammering in tent pegs when we arrived, looking up at the sky every time a drop hit him. He stopped when he noticed us come back with cans that clearly weren't soda. Frank must have recognized them because he laughed and commented that they had found a pretty cool surprise. Brian tossed him one, turning to Justin as he offered him one, too. Justin put a hand on his hips, looking like my mom when she was disappointed in me. Hell no, and you shouldn't either. Why would you just drink something you found on a rickety bridge? Brian blew out a long breath and popped another one. Because, Spaz, my brother left them for us. There was a note and everything, so cool your jets. Brian went back to work, mumbling darkly about being reckless and drinking things that could be poisoned or drugged. The tent came up, and not a moment too soon. The rain was really starting to come down, and it looked like there would be no fire tonight. We all headed into the tent, the wind picking up as it shoved the tent and made the ropes and pegs groan. It was big enough to fit all of us comfortably, and as the lamps came out, Brian held up the last 2 beers. Split the last 2? He asked. Everyone but Justin agreeing. We poured them into our camp cups, starting to clink them together before Brian turned to Justin. He was pretending to busy himself with something in the corner, but it was pretty clear that he didn't approve of what we were doing. Come on, Justin, it's not going to hurt you. I tell you what, if we see you becoming an alcoholic after 1 sip, I'll push you into the gorge and save you the embarrassment. Not funny, Justin said, but he had clearly worn him down. After another half-hearted refusal, he finally held out his cup to Justin and grinned as he poured the last of the beer into it. Then he clinked his glass with the rest of us, and we drank, everyone pulling a face which we laughed at. As the storm raged outside and we ate some MREs that we had packed just in case of bad weather, we started on our ghost stories. Brian was just telling us about a man with a hungry ghost in his basement when a big gust of wind hit the tent hard enough to collapse the middle brace and send it crashing down on us. We floundered for a minute, looking for the zipper as we tried to escape, and finally stepping out into the driving rain. It was still afternoon, the sun an angry line amidst the storm clouds, and I turned as I heard someone struggling with the tent. Justin was trying to pull it, the wind threatening to take it from him with every gust. Come on, he shouted. Help me get it under the trestle. It should work as a windbreak. I remembered the warning about a bear, but Brian just shouted back that it was either the bear or the rain. Besides, he said, if we see one, we'll just run like hell. It was hard to argue with him while the rain was coming down, so we all grabbed a tent post and moved it into the dry cave created by the trestle. Unlike a lot of train trestles I had seen in movies and on TV, this one was enclosed. I'm still not sure why, but it worked out well for us that day. We knocked in the tent pegs and sat in the tent as we watched the rain come down in buckets outside. Our stuff had gotten a little wet, but we hadn't brought anything that couldn't take a little water. As the light gave way to dark, we started breaking out the lanterns and cards, settling in for the night as we listened to the rain. As I lay there watching Justin and Brian play their 4th or 5th game of Magic the Gathering, I started hearing something besides the rain. It was a deep rumbling, like something snoring deep under the metal bridge. I thought again about Brian's brother telling us there might be a bear under there. I didn't really want to get eaten by a bear in my sleep, and if we were going to have to move again, it was better to do it now. I took out my flashlight and started looking into the shadowy depths of the trestle, but there was nothing to be seen. There was some thick-looking mud under here, some of it having made little stalagmites on the ground, but I couldn't see anything sleeping under there. It wouldn't make a very good den, I reflected, as I shone my light around. It was open on both sides, with the gorge coming in about 30 feet from our tent. There was really nowhere for anything to live down here, but as I swung the light from left to right, I could still hear that weird breathing. On a whim, I pointed it up and under the bridge, and that was when I saw it. First I thought it was a bunch of bats clustered together, but when it flinched under the beam of my light, I knew it was just one big thing. It was a huge bat, way bigger than me, with its large leathery wings pulled up tight around it. It was clinging to the bottom of the trestle bridge, and I imagined that
It had been a bad spot to hang when the trains were still in order. I spotted a slight movement to its left and found a second one hanging not far from it. In total, there were 4 of them, and when one of them shifted its wings and looked at me with a red, unhappy eye, I turned off the flashlight and zipped up the tent. The guys had some strong words when I started turning off lanterns, but I told them to be quiet and get down. "What?" Frank asked. "Did you see something out there?" "Was it the bear?" Brian asked, keeping his voice low as we hunkered down. "What bear?" Justin asked, but I waved a hand at them, trying to get them to be quiet. "It's not a bear," I hissed, but about that time, there was a weird sound from outside. It sounded like a high-pitched yawn as something came awake, followed by the rustle of wings. The talk in the tent had ceased now, and you could have heard a mouse fart. In the dark of the undercroft, we heard something huge and leathery take flight, rustling the canvas of the tent as it left the darkness. A second took flight a moment later, and I heard water cascade down as it shook the top of the trees. We all lay on our stomachs, panting for breath as we listened for more. I had seen 4, and only 2 had left so far. When something hit the ground about a foot from our tent, Justin had to slap a hand over his mouth to stop from screaming. The hushed remnant squeaked from between his fingers like a deflating balloon, but if the creature heard it, it never showed any sign. I could see the vague outline of it as it rose to its full height, and as it flapped its wings and took flight, the tent rustled like it had been in the wind. "Is that all of them?" Brian asked, 3 sets of eyes turning my way. I started to tell them that there had been a 4th, but that was when the 4th fell on top of the tent. We were all very lucky, all things considered. It landed right in the middle of the tent, shattering the plastic pole and sending the plastic material falling down around us. The creature's toenails scrambled across it noisily as it tried to find purchase, and when it took off, I was afraid it would simply carry us off with it. Instead, it just ripped a hole in the top as it flew off, and all of us were left reeling as we lay under the canvas. After a few minutes, it was decided that we would take our sleeping bags and our backpacks and leave the tent behind. We spent a miserable night huddled under the biggest tree we could find. We probably looked like fat caterpillars as we hunkered under the roots of that big tree, but we were as dry as could be managed. We all kept looking towards the skies, afraid the giant bat things would come after us, but they never did. We didn't talk, we didn't dare, and when the sun came up, we made our way out of the woods. We arrived at my house cold, scared, and unwilling to talk about what we had seen. My parents probably thought we had run afoul of something like a bear or a cougar, but they had no idea. That was about 2 weeks ago, and we haven't been back in the woods since. Just knowing that those things are in the woods makes us not want to be there after dark. It's a shame because the woods were our spot, our sanctuary, and now it seems tainted. Brian doesn't even leave the house after sunset these days, and Justin looks at the skies when he's walking. Frank says he doesn't really want to talk about it, and I think he's stoned a lot of the time. I dream about it sometimes, the way that big red eye looked at me when I shone my flashlight on it, and I can't help but wonder what something that big eats. I think it will be a good long time before I talk any of them back into the woods, and our camping days may be at an end. I think that'll do it for our great stories today. But don't be too upset. I'm sure we'll have more stories tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that, when you join me back here by the fire for more cozy horror with yours truly, Dr. Plague. Until then, I'd like to wish you all a wonderful day and a spooky evening.